The sun peeked over the sleepy streets of Crescentville, painting the suburban homes in hues of amber and gold. Franklin Morris tightened the laces on his running shoes, pausing for a moment to savor the stillness. It was his favorite time of day, the town barely awake, his breath sinking with the rhythmic thud of his feet on the pavement. At 68, the former U.S. Attorney General carried himself with a quiet confidence, his sharp mind as steady as his stride. Jogging was his ritual, his meditation. It was where he reflected on the past and imagined the future. Justice, fairness, and accountability weren't just concepts to him. They were his life's work. He had spent decades fighting battles in courtrooms and Congress halls, but Crescentville was different, a quaint retreat where life was slower, softer. Or so it seemed. As he approached the town square, the sweet, yeasty scent of fresh bread drifted from Crescentville Bakery, a local landmark. Franklin smiled, tipping an imaginary hat toward the shop's window. But his routine took an abrupt turn when he heard a muffled cry. "Please stop." The voice was faint, almost swallowed by the morning quiet, but it froze him mid-stride. He turned sharply toward the alley beside the bakery. Two young men in dark hoodies wrestled with an elderly woman, her frail hands gripping her handbag like it was her lifeline. One yanked the bag, while the other stood as lookout, his gaze darting nervously around. Franklin's heart surged, not with fear, but with resolve. "Hey," he barked, his deep voice echoing off the alley walls. The two thieves froze for a moment, startled, before sizing him up. The lookout hesitated, his bravado slipping, but the other tightened his grip on the bag. Franklin stepped closer, his strides deliberate. He wasn't armed, wasn't as fast as he used to be, but his presence carried weight. "Drop it," he said, his tone firm but calm. "Now." The lookout nudged his partner, panic creeping into his voice. "Let's go, man." "Forget it." "Shut up," the other hissed, yanking the bag harder. Franklin took another step forward, his eyes locked on the thieves. The look wasn't one of anger or intimidation. It was pure authority, a silent assurance that he wasn't backing down. The thief cursed under his breath, then let go, shoving the bag into the elderly woman's arms. "Whatever, old man. Not worth it." The two bolted down the alley, disappearing around the corner. Franklin exhaled slowly, the adrenaline still buzzing in his veins. He turned to the woman, who was trembling but unharmed, clutching her bag as if it held her very soul. "Are you all right, ma'am?" Franklin asked, his voice soft now. She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. Thank you. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't." "It's all right," he assured her, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. "You're safe now." Behind them, a curious onlooker began dialing a number, likely the police. Franklin sighed, knowing the quiet of his morning was officially over. As the sirens began to wail in the distance, Franklin glanced back down the alley, the thieves long gone but their shadows lingering in his mind. He wasn't just jogging anymore. This wasn't just another peaceful morning in Crescentville. Something told him this was the start of a very different kind of day. Franklin Morris helped the elderly woman steady herself, his hand firm, yet gentle on her trembling arm. Her words were shaky but clear. You saved me. Those boys." She paused to catch her breath, tears welling in her eyes. Franklin gave her a reassuring smile, his voice calm and steady. "You're safe now, ma'am. Let's get you sitting down," he said, guiding her toward the bench outside the bakery. As the adrenaline from the chase ebbed, he glanced around and noticed the growing crowd of onlookers. Curious faces peered from behind the bakery's glass, while a few passers-by slowed their steps, murmuring among themselves. The distant wail of a police siren cut through the morning calm, and within moments, a patrol car screeched to a halt at the curb. Franklin turned toward the sound, expecting relief. Instead, what stepped out of the car was tension personified. Officer Jack Burnett was a man who carried his authority like a weapon. His uniform was crisp, his boots polished to a mirror shine, but his demeanor screamed impatience. He adjusted his belt as he approached, his eyes darting between Franklin and the elderly woman. "Step away from her," Jack barked, his hand hovering near his holstered gun. Franklin raised an eyebrow, caught off guard by the tone. "Officer, there's been a robbery." "I said, step away," Jack interrupted, his voice sharp. He pointed a gloved finger directly at Franklin, his jaw tightening. The elderly woman, still shaken, clutched Franklin's sleeve. No, officer, you've got it wrong. He was helping me. Those boys." Jack's hand shot up, silencing her. "Ma'am, I'll get to you in a minute. Right now, I need to hear from him." His eyes narrowed at Franklin, suspicion simmering beneath the surface. Franklin took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm. He'd seen men like Jack before. Officers too quick to assume, too ready to pounce. "I'm Franklin Morris," he began, his tone measured. "I was jogging when I saw two young men trying to take her purse. I intervened. They ran off. That's all there is to it." But Jack wasn't listening. His gaze swept over Franklin's athletic gear, a gray hoodie, jogging pants, and sneakers, and lingered for a moment too long. His expression hardened. "Jogging, huh? At this hour? Near the scene of a crime." Franklin felt the weight of the officer's words, the insinuation hanging heavy in the air. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder, some whispering in Franklin's defense, others standing silent, watching the scene unfold like a live drama. "Officer," the elderly woman pleaded again, her voice firmer now, "you've got it wrong. This man saved me. He chased those boys off." Jack barely glanced at her. His focus was locked on Franklin. "Let me see some ID," he demanded, his hand resting on his belt, fingers grazing the handle of his taser. Franklin could feel the tension thickening, the crowd pressing closer. He stood tall, his shoulders back, his voice even. "I don't carry ID when I jog, but I assure you, I'm not a threat." "That's what they all say," Jack muttered, loud enough for Franklin to hear. The words hit like a slap, but Franklin didn't flinch. He met Jack's gaze, his eyes steady. "I'm telling you the truth," he said, his voice calm yet firm. But Jack's hand moved closer to his holster, and Franklin could see the unease in the officer's posture. The elderly woman rose from the bench, her frail frame trembling with frustration. "Why won't you listen to me? He's a hero, not a criminal." "Ma'am, please stay back," Jack snapped, his tone dismissive. Franklin felt the situation spiraling, the officer's assumptions digging deeper. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, their whispers growing louder. Franklin knew this was about more than just a misunderstanding. It was about perception, bias, and a refusal to see beyond appearances. He glanced at the officer's badge, Jack Burnett. The name might as well have been carved in stone, rigid and unyielding. Franklin took another breath, steadying himself. This wasn't the first time he'd faced a challenge like this, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. The question was, how far would Jack take it? As the officer's hand hovered over his weapon, Franklin knew one thing for sure. Staying calm was no longer just a choice. It was a necessity. The morning sun hung low, its golden rays cutting through the quiet streets of Crescentville. Franklin Morris stood steady, his breath even despite the adrenaline coursing through him. The elderly woman clung to his arm, her hands trembling as she pleaded with the officer. "Please, he was helping me. Those boys, he scared them off." Her voice cracked, but Officer Jack Burnett barely glanced at her. His cold, skeptical eyes were locked on Franklin. "Ma'am, step aside," Jack barked, his hand resting on his belt. "I'll handle this." Franklin raised his hands slowly, palms open, a gesture of calm. He had seen this kind of misplaced authority before, the kind that swelled when fed by fear and bias. "Officer," Franklin began, his voice measured, "I think there's been a misunderstanding. I was jogging when I saw her in trouble. I intervened to help." "Yeah, I bet you did," Jack cut him off, his lips curling into a skeptical smirk. "Funny how you're the only one standing here, looking suspicious." The crowd around them had grown, a mix of curious onlookers and murmuring witnesses. A young mother whispered to her son, pointing at Franklin. A man in a business suit shook his head and stepped closer, as if to intervene. Franklin stayed calm, his heart steady, but his mind racing. He was no stranger to confrontation, but this wasn't a courtroom. This was the street, and the officer's authority hung in the balance like a loaded weapon. The elderly woman tried again, stepping forward. He's telling the truth. He chased those boys away. Jack raised a hand to silence her, his focus unwavering. Sir, I'm going to need you to step back and keep your hands where I can see them. Franklin's jaw tightened. He noticed the shift in Jack's stance, the way his fingers hovered closer to his holster now. A slow, deliberate move, one that sent a message. Officer Burnett, Franklin said, his voice deepening. Listen to her. I've been in your position. I understand protocol, but you're making a mistake here. That caught Jack's attention for a moment. His eyes flickered, narrowing. Oh, so you've been a cop too, huh? Is that what you're trying to tell me? No, Franklin replied, his tone unwavering. I was the U.S. Attorney General. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, a ripple of recognition passing through a few faces. But Jack's smirk only deepened, his skepticism hardening into arrogance. Right, Jack scoffed. And I'm the President of the United States. Hands where I can see them. Now. Franklin obeyed, lifting his hands higher, his calm unbroken. The elderly woman stepped between them now, her frail frame trembling with frustration. You're wrong, officer. He saved me. Those boys ran when they saw him. I said, step back, ma'am. Jack's voice rose, sharp and commanding. The woman hesitated, her protest faltering. Franklin's voice cut through the tension, low but firm. Officer, you're escalating a situation that doesn't need escalation. Jack's hand finally grazed his holster, his fingers wrapping around the grip. The air seemed to freeze, the murmurs in the crowd falling silent. Franklin met Jack's gaze, his expression calm but resolute. Inside, Franklin felt the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about him anymore. The crowd was watching, and the officer's bias was playing out in real time. Franklin knew one wrong move could turn this scene into a tragedy, a headline. Sir, Jack barked again, his voice tight with authority. Get on the ground. Now. The tension hung thick in the air, a single moment stretching endlessly. Franklin didn't move. Instead, he spoke, his voice even and deliberate. I'm reaching into my pocket. Slowly. You'll see my ID. Jack's grip tightened on the holster, but he didn't speak, his jaw clenching as Franklin moved with painstaking care. Every eye in the crowd was glued to his movements, the silence now deafening. Franklin's hand emerged, holding his worn leather wallet. He opened it with one hand, pulling out his ID and holding it up for Jack to see. The officer leaned forward, his eyes scanning the card. The silence broke with a sharp intake of breath from someone in the crowd. Jack's face froze, the smirk vanishing as his lips parted in shock. The ID gleamed in the sunlight, the name and title unmistakable. Franklin Morris, former U.S. Attorney General. The crowd erupted in murmurs, disbelief spreading like wildfire. Jack's hand slipped off the holster, his expression shifting from disbelief to panic. Franklin lowered his hand slowly, his gaze steady on Jack. Now, officer, he said, his voice steady but tinged with steel, shall we talk about what just happened here? The weight of the moment fell squarely on Jack's shoulders, his confidence crumbling under the judgment of the crowd. Franklin didn't need to raise his voice or make demands. The truth was already on his side. The morning air, once crisp and still, now buzzed with tension. Franklin stood firm, his breath steady despite the gun pointed squarely at him. The crowd murmured uneasily, their eyes darting between the composed elder and the young officer, whose trembling hands betrayed his bravado. Step back. Jack Burnett barked, his voice taut with authority, but beneath it, there was a thin, fragile edge. His finger hovered dangerously close to the trigger. Franklin raised his hand slightly, his expression a mix of calm and measured control. Officer, he said evenly, you're making a mistake. A mistake. Jack's face darkened, a flush creeping up his neck. He glanced at the growing crowd, their judgmental stares prickling at his pride. I said step away from her. Now. Please, the elderly woman interjected, her voice quivering. She clung to Franklin's arm as though it were a lifeline. This man saved me. He's not the criminal. But Jack wasn't listening. His mind had locked onto a narrative, one that fit the biases he'd carried onto the force. A black man, disheveled from a morning jog, standing at the scene of a crime? To Jack, the conclusion seemed obvious. Franklin exhaled slowly, the way he had taught himself in countless high-stakes situations. Negotiations with hostile diplomats had taught him the power of silence, of measured words, and of not letting emotions take control. This was no different. "Look at me, officer," Franklin said, his deep voice cutting through the noise. "Do I look like a threat to you? Use your judgment, your real judgment. Listen to her." He nodded toward the elderly woman. Jack's jaw tightened. The truth was inching closer, but his pride, his need to assert control, wouldn't let him see it. "I don't care who you say you are. Hands where I can see them. Don't try anything stupid." Franklin moved slowly, deliberately. "I'm reaching for my ID," he said. "That's all."
"Don't,"
Jack shouted, his gun jerking slightly, making the crowd flinch. Franklin froze. The weight of the moment pressed down on everyone watching. Somewhere in the distance, a baby cried. A teenager whispered, "Is he really going to shoot that guy?" Franklin met Jack's eyes, steady and unafraid. "If you pull that trigger, officer, you'll not only end an innocent man's life, but you'll also ruin your own." The words landed like stones, cracking the fragile foundation of Jack's authority. His hand wavered. Carefully, Franklin reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his wallet, flipping it open with practiced precision. The gold emblem caught the sunlight, gleaming like a beacon of truth. "Franklin Morris," he said calmly, holding the badge aloft. "Former United States Attorney General." The air was sucked out of the scene. Jack's eyes widened as the realization hit him like a freight train. The murmurs in the crowd erupted into outright gasps. "Wait, he's the Franklin Morris?" "The Attorney General," someone whispered loudly. Jack's hand dropped, the gun falling to his side. His face turned ashen as he stared at the badge, then at Franklin. The weight of his mistake pressed visibly on his shoulders.
I
didn't," Jack stammered, but the words wouldn't come. The elderly woman stepped forward, her voice suddenly strong and resolute. "This man saved my life. And you," she pointed a trembling finger at Jack, "you tried to take his for no reason other than your prejudice." The crowd murmured louder, their judgment now directed squarely at the officer. Franklin didn't gloat. He didn't shout or berate. Instead, he looked at Jack with an expression that was almost pity. "Officer," he said quietly, "justice isn't about power. It's about doing what's right. Think about that." Sirens wailed in the distance as a police supervisor arrived on the scene. Jack barely had time to process the repercussions of his actions before his superior was at his side, taking the gun from his holster and placing him on administrative leave. Franklin lowered his ID and looked out at the crowd, whose expressions ranged from admiration to disbelief. He met their gazes with calm, unshakable dignity. He wasn't just a man standing up for himself, he was standing up for what was right. As the chaos subsided, Franklin turned to the elderly woman and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You're safe now," he said softly. "That's what matters most." And with that, the moment ended. But the lesson? That would linger far longer. The air around the bakery felt electric, charged with the weight of what had just transpired. Franklin Morris stood tall, his breath steady despite the chaos swirling around him. In his hand, he held his ID, the seal of the Department of Justice glinting under the morning sun. The murmurs in the gathered crowd grew louder, disbelief rippling like a wave through the onlookers. "Former U.S. Attorney General," someone whispered. Officer Jack Bennett's face shifted from righteous indignation to a pale mask of shock. His hand, still clutching his gun, trembled ever so slightly before he lowered the weapon. For a moment, he seemed frozen in place, as though the weight of his mistake was too heavy to process. "Why, Jack stammered, but his words trailed off as the elderly woman, still clutching her purse, stepped forward. Her voice, frail but resolute, sliced through the tension. "You ought to be ashamed of yourself," she barked, pointing a trembling finger at Jack. "This man saved me. Those boys, they tried to rob me, and he chased them off. And what did you do? You pointed a gun at him like he was the criminal. The crowd murmured in agreement, their eyes darting between the furious woman and the stunned officer. Jack opened his mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. The weight of the scene, the presence of the crowd, and the undeniable truth of Franklin's identity all bore down on him. "Miss," Franklin interjected, his tone calm but commanding, "let's not escalate this further. Officer Burnett made a mistake, an egregious one. But this moment is about accountability, not vengeance." The elderly woman huffed, her glare fixed on Jack. Accountability? Then he better explain himself to the department. As if on cue, the sharp wail of a second squad car cut through the murmurs. A senior officer stepped out, his presence immediately shifting the energy in the space. Lieutenant Graves was a seasoned veteran of the force, known for his no-nonsense demeanor. He took in the scene, the gathered crowd, Jack standing stiffly with his weapon holstered, and Franklin holding his badge out with quiet authority. "Jack," Graves said, his voice low and firm, "what the hell is going on here?" Before Jack could stumble through an explanation, the elderly woman spoke up, her words tumbling over each other. "This man," she said, motioning to Franklin, "saved my life. And that officer, he accused him, treated him like a criminal, and even drew his gun on him." Graves turned to Franklin, his eyes narrowing slightly as he processed the situation. "Sir, your name?" "Franklin Morris," came the even reply. "Former U.S. Attorney General." Graves blinked, his expression briefly betraying his surprise before his professionalism returned. "Mr. Morris, I apologize on behalf of the department. Officer Burnett's actions will be reviewed immediately." The lieutenant turned back to Jack, his voice cold now. "Hand me your badge and gun. You're on administrative leave pending investigation." Jack's face burned crimson as he fumbled to comply. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, some jeering at him as he passed over his badge. The humiliation was palpable, but Franklin's expression remained unreadable, his composure unwavering. As Jack turned to leave, Franklin spoke again, his voice cutting through the noise. "Officer Burnett." Jack paused, his shoulders stiffening as he turned to face Franklin. The older man's gaze was piercing but devoid of malice. "Accountability isn't just about punishment," Franklin said evenly. "It's about learning. I hope you take this opportunity to reflect on how easily assumptions can lead to dangerous mistakes." For a moment, Jack seemed as though he might respond, but instead, he gave a small nod before retreating to his squad car. The crowd parted to let him pass, their eyes filled with disdain and disappointment. Lieutenant Graves extended his hand toward Franklin. "Again, sir, I'm deeply sorry. If there's anything you need—" "Thank you, Lieutenant," Franklin replied, shaking his hand firmly. "But what I need is already happening. Justice." As the squad cars pulled away, the tension in the crowd began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of awe and respect for the man who had turned a moment of humiliation into a lesson in integrity. Franklin glanced at the elderly woman, who was now smiling at him through tears. "You're a remarkable man," she said, her voice soft now. "Thank you for everything." Franklin gave her a kind smile. "No thanks needed, ma'am. Just take care of yourself." As the crowd began to disperse, Franklin stood for a moment, taking in the quiet that had finally returned to the streets of Crescentville. He adjusted his jogging jacket, his heartbeat finally settling. The sun was higher now, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward something brighter. With a deep breath, Franklin turned back toward his path and resumed his jog, each step a reminder of his purpose, not just as a retired attorney general, but as a man committed to justice in all its forms. The early morning sunlight filtered through the trees as Franklin Morris walked away from the scene, the sound of murmuring voices and shuffling feet fading behind him. He paused at the corner of the block, pulling in a slow, steady breath. The adrenaline that had coursed through him moments earlier was finally beginning to wane, leaving a quiet ache in his chest, a familiar weight he'd carried too many times before. Crescentville had always seemed different, quieter, kinder, almost untouched by the divisive shadows that loomed over the rest of the world. But today, that illusion had shattered. Franklin adjusted the brim of his baseball cap, a deliberate motion as if to shield himself from the reality of what had just transpired. A voice called out, breaking his thoughts. "Mr. Morris, wait." He turned to see Mrs. Evelyn Hart, the elderly woman he'd saved, hobbling toward him with surprising determination for her frail frame. Her face, lined with decades of life, glowed with gratitude as she reached him. "Thank you," she said, clutching her purse tightly. "You didn't have to step in. You could have just kept jogging. But you didn't. You saved me." Franklin offered her a small, warm smile. "It was the right thing to do, Mrs. Hart. That's all." She shook her head. "The right thing to do," she repeated, her voice trembling slightly. "I just wish more people thought like you." "That officer," her words trailed off, bitterness creeping into her tone. Franklin raised a hand gently, stopping her. "He made a mistake," he said, his voice steady but firm. "A dangerous one, yes, but I've spent my life teaching people that accountability isn't just about punishment. It's about learning. And that's what I hope happens here." Mrs. Hart blinked, her expression softening. "You're too kind," she said quietly. "But I suppose that's what makes you who you are." He gave her a reassuring nod. "Take care of yourself, Mrs. Hart. And if you ever need anything, you know where to find me." With that, he turned and began jogging once more, the rhythm of his steps falling into sync with the steady beat of his heart. As he jogged, Franklin's mind wandered back to the crowd, their faces a mixture of disbelief and silent condemnation as Officer Jack Bennett lowered his weapon. It wasn't the first time Franklin had encountered prejudice or bias, but it was the first time in years he'd felt it so acutely. And yet, he'd stood firm, refusing to let anger cloud his judgment. Justice, he thought, wasn't just about laws or badges. It was about doing what was right, even when it was hard, even when it hurt. A small boy on a bike zipped past him, his mother calling after him from the front porch of a nearby house. Franklin smiled to himself. Crescentville wasn't perfect, but no place was. What mattered was the effort, the push to make things better, one small act at a time. By the time Franklin reached his driveway, the tension in his chest had lifted. He paused, leaning against the gate to stretch, his breath steady now. He looked up at the sky, the morning sun climbing higher, bathing the neighborhood in a golden glow. A memory from his years as U.S. Attorney General surfaced, his father's voice ringing clear in his mind. "It's not the titles or the power that make a man. It's the choices he makes when no one's watching." Today, Franklin had made his choice. And though the weight of injustice still lingered, he knew he'd carried himself the way his father would have wanted, with dignity, with strength, and with unshakable resolve. As he stepped into his home, Franklin felt lighter, his heart steadied by the belief that, even in retirement, his fight for justice was far from over. Subscribe to our channel for soul-stirring stories.